Hello and welcome. We've now had more than 10 virtual events for the 6th Unbound Book Festival, and tonight you're in for a wonderful evening. My name is Donald Quist, and I'm a member of the Unbound Programming Committee. In this event, Speculative Fiction by Writers of Color, Nisi Shaw will speak to Chanello Onwalu, Kathleen Alcala, and Minsu Kang about how setting narratives in spaces beyond the real world can be a kind of activism, how writing stories that involve supernatural and futuristic elements might prompt us to challenge our histories, reimagine who we are, and conceive new futures. As you may know, the festival has always been completely free to attend, and this wouldn't be possible without the generosity of the hundreds and hundreds of people who've supported us financially over the years. On behalf of everyone who volunteers for Unbound and everyone who attends these events, we're so grateful to each and every one of you. And we are so glad you've been kind enough to give. For real, thank you. A list of everyone who has given over the past 2 years is on the website, and if you'd like to contribute yourself, you can do so by going to the website and clicking on the donate button. We're a registered nonprofit, and we are completely run by volunteers, so everything we receive goes directly to putting on these events. Support also comes from the City of Columbia, specifically the Office of Cultural Affairs and the Convention and Visitors Bureau. KBIA and Como Magazine are our media sponsors. A full list of our sponsors and supporters is available on our website, unboundbookfestival.com. And this evening, particular thanks to tonight's event sponsor, Friends of the MU Libraries. We're very grateful to them for their support over the years. Please remember that if you miss an event, everything is available for viewing or reviewing on both our Facebook page and our YouTube. If you haven't already, please do take a moment to review the whole schedule, all 3 months of it, on our website, and plan to attend as many events as you like. While you're there, you can also sign up for the festival newsletter, which goes out on Monday mornings and will keep you up to date with what to expect each week. And please tell your friends about the festival. Now, please welcome the incredible Macy Shaw, who will be moderating this panel.
Hey, hi.
Hey, how are you?
To be here. Thank you for the welcoming and all the warmth that you've shown me.
Oh, thank you. I'm geeking. You're one of my favorite writers, so it's great to be here. So thank you.
So I get to moderate this panel because I was the editor of New Sun's original speculative fiction by people of color. So yes, there it is. That's what we did. And I will introduce, first of all, the mighty and lovely Minsu Kang, who teaches at the University of Missouri and who I have never met physically, only read all the work that I could find. A writer, a translator, a novelist. I got to read the novel before it came out. Woohoo! And Minsu has prepared a sort of a summary of what we did together and what he did on his own. And here it is.
Thank you, Nisi. It was such an absolute pleasure to be in this collection with such wonderful stories. It was just a pleasant experience all throughout, and also going through the other stories written by other people was wonderful. So, so as per the instructions that I received, I guess I'll talk about two things: one, what my story is about, and also the experience of writing speculative fiction as a person of color. So my story is called The Virtue of Unfaithful Translations. And it's written in the style of a writing by a historian who's made a spectacular discovery about something that happened very long time ago, which was that there were these two countries, one of which is loosely based on Ming Dynasty China, that could have gone to war with this other country in a war that could have been catastrophic, could have led to the death of hundreds of thousands. But the war never happened. And what this historian discovered, that the last-minute peace agreement that was made to prevent the war from occurring was the result of the translators who worked for the two different sides deliberately writing bad translations knowingly, in order to bring about a situation where both kings would, both the rulers would regard it as a bad idea to actually go into conflict. And so because my day job, my teaching job at University of Missouri in St. Louis is as a history professor, so I usually bring a lot of historical ideas into this. So, and as for the other question, well, one of the things that a lot of people have pointed out about speculative writers is that there's inordinate numbers of them who spent at least part of their childhood in more than one country. And I think one could fairly figure out why that would aid in somebody becoming a speculative writer, of coming into different cultures and different ways of viewing the world and so on, which makes it easier for, if that person happened to be a person of imagination, easier to imagine other worlds as well. And that was certainly the case with me. I'm from South Korea, and my father was a diplomat for the Korean government, so I ended up growing up in half a dozen countries. And in the West and in the Middle East and in East Asia and so on. And so that came fairly natural for me to imagine things in completely different ways and so on. But I did realize, this is a thought that I had while I was reading this collection of other stories written by this for this wonderful collection, which Nisi did such a good job of editing, which is that even for those who did not spend time in their childhood in another country, I think if you grow up as a minority, a racial or ethnic minority in a country, you would have had the same kind of experience, right? You live in two different cultures, and you see the conflict between those two cultures and so on, and that also for you becomes easier to imagine an entirely new fictional culture as well, right? And so I think that there's a commonality, that for people who've traveled around the world and who may not have traveled around the world, but have seen the kind of intercultural differences and ways of viewing the world, and also being aware of the hierarchy involved, right? Especially if you're a minority, that are not treated the same as the majority of people, right? So I think that's where I get a lot of my inspiration, reading speculative fiction and saying, well, this is awfully from the perspective of one culture, and you could even go beyond it, and one gender and so on and so on, and that kind of challenge that comes naturally to me as somebody who did grow up in a bunch of different cultures, and as a historian who trained myself to think in those terms, imagining new worlds, especially in a way that defies sort of conventions of Western-based cultures, is something that is both a pleasure and something that comes rather natural to me.
Thank you. Yes, that really resonated with me. Thank you so much. I actually will just interject here that at one point, Bruce Sterling, a speculative fiction author, asked me if I had ever been sort of alienated from the culture. Had I, lived in another country? Had I spent a year in a hospital or something? And I said no. And I realized, as you just pointed out, by living where I was already in two countries. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And now I will move on to another panelist. I will be introducing Chanello Onwalu, who I actually have met in person. We both attended the Clarion West writing workshop, and more about that later. But so I know Chanello as a short story author. I have not ever been edited by Chanello, but I know that Chanello does edit. And I know that we share this dream of bringing our dreams to people. So, Chanello, you said that you also had a statement, as well as you had prepared a reading from your work for New Suns.
Yeah, so it's less of a statement than sort of a bunch of bullet points, but a little bit about the story itself. It's a short story, and it's about a mysterious world event that brings magic back into the world. It's an event that leaves Africa as the only continent standing. And it follows two ex-scammer sisters who find themselves running a hotel for magical creatures. And so this is the story basically of what happens one night when the wrong guy walks through the doors. And I'll kind of leave it at that because that's sort of sorry. This is actually the fine print. That was a different story entirely. So the fine print is actually about a young man who lives in a world where every year people get a catalog of wishes from genie. So the genie helped free their people several years ago, and now all it asks every year is the fulfillment of people's wishes. And so this is a guy who wished for a particular fox wife, and now his wish has come due. And so this is what happens when he is being asked to make the payment that his wish cost. So the thing about writing as a person of color, Minsu said it wonderfully. It's interesting that we have sort of similar background, because I too am the child of diplomatic parents. I lived in 7 countries. I learned 3 languages. I've forgotten all of them, except the one I'm speaking now. And I think as a writer of color in any genre, but I think in speculative fiction especially, there's a sense of having one foot in 2 different worlds. And it's always a world that highlights your differences. So in a world that people can imagine just about anything, it's surprising how often we tend to imagine the same things over and over again. And one of the biggest experience for me has just been both the pull and push of belonging and not belonging. So African speculative fiction in particular is enjoying a resurgence right now. And, we've got the Black Panther film that came out a few years ago. We've got this huge explosion that's just been going on exponentially of Black authors and their imaginative worlds. However, and while I celebrate this, because as a person of color, as a woman, as a Black woman, as an African woman who has been writing this stuff for, since I was 13, it's so amazing to see this like explosion of stories. But part of me worries that it's kind of a trend. And I worry that, we are seeing a time when a lot of our fiction is getting attention, but the structures in place for how that fiction is produced is not keeping up. So we're still not seeing, presses that are run and have a plurality of voices. It's still the same set of people, the same struggles that, I was listening to a story about Octavia Butler, and it was kind of sad how some of the stuff that she was dealing with in the 80s, the stuff that, I have dealt with in, the 2000s. And I hope that with the resurgence of interest, New Suns has been winning awards left, right, and center, and it should, because it's an amazing collection. Not just saying that because I'm in it, but I do worry that when the fad is gone, the attention will go too, because the people behind the scenes, the editors, the agents, publishers, are still overwhelmingly white, and so that makes me both excited and energized, but also wary. So I have sort of one foot in and one foot out, and hoping that this lasts and hoping that this will become something bigger than just, oh wow, Black people have been writing this stuff, or oh wow, people of color write this stuff. Great. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. I'm hoping that that's not what happens. In terms of contributing to the collection, it's been a blast. Nisi took this weird little story that I wrote actually in Clarion at that workshop and turned it into something amazing. And now I get to be part of this collection and this adventure. You know, it's won a Locus. It just won a British Science Fiction award, and yeah, I can't wait to see where else it goes and what else we all do. You know, so I have a reading from it. It's part of the opening of the story. Hopefully I won't take up too much of your time with that. So I will warn you, there's an 8-month-old in the background. They're very cranky. Please bear with me. The red dust swirled around the black vehicle as it slid silently into the village. Nuhu was sitting among the other men under the giant flame tree in the village square, sipping sorghum beer and gossiping aimlessly. He watched with dread as the driverless car hummed to a stop just beyond them. Its clean, glossy lines looked out of place in the desiccated landscape. A crowd of children gathered to look at the car, but scurried off when the door opened. The woman who emerged was not exactly what Nuhu was expecting. Tall and fair, she wore a modest red hijab and black abaya. It was not until she was close that he could tell that her kohl-rimmed eyes had no irises or pupils. "Who is Nuhu Aliu Dambata here?" she called out. Nuhu's beard turned to mud in his mouth. The other men suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere and crept hastily away. He was tempted to feign ignorance and pretend he was another, but that never worked. The question was merely a formality. She knew exactly who he was. They always knew. "I am he," he said, standing. She regarded him without expression. "I am your final notice," she said. Nuhu felt the cold hand of despair grip his heart. His legs felt weak, and he forced himself to remain upright. "You have 3 days." Wait, let's discuss this," he said, unashamed of the note of pleading that had crept into his voice. "Please." "There is nothing to discuss. The terms of the contract are clear." "But he is my son." Nuhu's voice trailed away as he stared into her blank face. This was futile, he realized. How could she, a spell-made flesh, possibly understand? She turned to walk away, and a surge of anger rose in him. "This is not fair," he screamed at her retreating form. She paused and turned back. A flicker of something passed over her face. "Fair?" she echoed. There was an air of detached anger to him, as if the ire that briefly distorted her features was not her own. Nuhu knew he was hearing the voice of the elemental being that animated her. "How is this not fair? When you sealed the contract, just what did you think would happen?" A sudden hope surged through him. This was the first time any of them had ever spoken to him beyond their protocols, and he lunged at the slim chance of hope this invited. Crossing to close the space between them, he dropped his voice to a pleading whisper. "Please, ask me for anything else. I will give it. Don't do this." 3 days, the spell said. "Give him up peacefully, or I will be forced to fulfill my mandate." The woman strode back to the driverless car and got in. With a near-silent whoosh, the car drove off. Nuhu's stomach roiled and a wave of nausea overcame him. He barely had time to lurch to the space behind Malam Beu's hut before he vomited his sorghum beer. Wiping his mouth edge of his keffieh, he began to cry.
Oh my gosh, what a place to leave us.
If you want to know the rest, go buy the collection.
Yeah, I do know the rest, actually. But yeah, but for everybody else that hasn't read it. So let's get started with our talk. We are hoping that another author will join us, Kathleen Alcala, but for now, we'll talk amongst ourselves. The first thing I wanted to touch on, actually, is something that you mentioned, Chanello, the cyclical nature of trends in literature and in pop culture and in culture in general. I was just last night watching a movie called Harlem Nights, which was directed by Eddie Murphy and included appearances by Red Fox and Richard Pryor. And it was old, but it it reminded me of a time when there was this resurgence in African American culture. There were all these films like Cotton Comes to Harlem and Shaft, and there were books, and there was just this sort of like focus on specifically on African American, not necessarily on other people of color as culture creators. I would like to think that it's different this time because it's broader and deeper. Do either of you have anything to say about this? I'll go to you first, Chanello.
So I wonder about that. I too, I remember when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was this big surge of Black television as well. You know, I remember the sitcoms of the 90s, like Living Single and you know, different world, and you know, and there was that it felt too then like finally these stories were coming to light. I remember there was also a similar surge in Asian American films. I remember I think that was about when Joy Luck Club came out, and we all really thought that this was different. This is going to be a thing. But then I realized that a similar trend had taken place about 20 years before that in the 70s, when there was this big surge. And so it seems that like every 20 years, mainstream or, you know, white-owned media remembers, oh yeah, no, there are people of color out there. I bet they have great stories. We hear from them for a while, and then people just kind of lose interest, I guess. White people specifically. So I hope that is deeper. I hope that this goes beyond. I know that, for one thing, this is global. It's more global than it used to be, right? It's not just, you know, mainstream white media discovering the people of color within its own borders, but it's also, there's a sense too that stories from other parts of the globe, there's a huge resurgence, I guess, of you know, stories coming out of East Asia and Africa and South Asia. So yeah, I hope. I mean, I think part of it is that there's also a massive geopolitical shift underway, where power is sort of moving a little bit out of the hands of a singular Western, you know, hegemony. But that's not to say that things are going to necessarily permanently shift, right?
Yeah.
Especially because, you know, the people who are running these companies are not shifting. You know, there's a lot of like, let's get some new interns in, but are those interns going to be promoted, or are they going to be racism out of the system before they hit middle management, you know, and can accumulate the experience that would then put them in play for higher positions? Let's see.
Yeah, I would like to hear what you have to say on this topic, Minsu.
Yeah, you know, as a historian who deals with cycles and ups and downs of civilization all the time, Yeah, well, it is impossible to know whether the changes occur is going to be something permanent on the level of something like the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Revolution. I mean, that ends up changing the world and it changed forever, right? Or it is just a blip. It's like the proliferation of representative governments during the Renaissance, every single one of which falls back into some kind of authoritarian system once the Renaissance is over. I don't know. I mean, I don't really but I think, from our present point of view, I think all we can do is take advantage of this moment of light and do what we can to make permanent changes, right? And so instead of I don't think I think it will be a waste of our time to really try to predict the future and see and think about whether this is going to last or not. But yeah, I mean, do what we can while the spotlight is on. It's interesting. I mean, this I think it's related to this. But 2 years ago in Korea, I gave a talk at Seoul National University, and one of the things I was telling the Korean audience there was that as a Korean, I live in America at a very, very strange time for a Korean, because when I first came to America in the early 80s, still then, South Korea was still regarded as everything that was coming out of South Korea was just kind of second rate, and it was cheap, and it was just kind of, and a lot of things that people knew about South Korea was like, how bad the cars were. And anyway, but it's weird how in the last couple of years, everything Korean has become hip. I mean, I have all kinds of, students who don't know any Korean in the Midwest are all listening to K-pop, and they are watching K-dramas on, on Netflix, and loving Korean films and so on. And one of the things I said to the Korean audience is that I don't know if this is going to last or if this is just a flash in the pan before they move on to something else. Right? Because whether the impact of Korean popular culture on the world, including the United States of America, is something that's going to be there for. I mean, like for instance, American obsession with Japanese manga is fairly long lasting. I mean, it hasn't gone away, although a lot of obsession with other aspects of Japanese culture has gone down. And so what I told them is that it is my hope that although culturally, intellectually, and financially, all this is great for Korea, I wanted to move on to more high culture stuff, right? So that it doesn't stop just at K-dramas and K-pop, but like the best literature coming out of Korea, the best the best philosophical writings coming out of Korea, and the best art that comes out of Korea. And I think once those get into the mainstream, that is much more likely to have a long-lasting impact. So I think, to conclude, I think the best we can do is take advantage of this moment in sunlight, whether it's lasts for long or it doesn't, and try to create as much quality stuff as possible, so that it will be the quality itself that guarantees its longevity.
It's not just creating it; it's curating it. I think is part of that, and you, Minsu, have done this in some sense with the translations that you have put together of different literary traditional pieces. And you also, Chanello, I believe, when you founded a magazine, Omenana?
Co-founded.
Co-founded.
I guess I hope so. I mean, what we were trying to do at the time was we looked around and didn't see the voices that we knew were there. We didn't see them reflected anywhere else, and so we wanted to sort of give them a home, more like a nest where we could like incubate some people and give people encouragement and put forth things. And what's been so awesome is seeing a lot of those writers who first published in Omenana now like having book deals, and like Wale Talabi, one of our contributors, just signed a 2-3 book deal with Daw. I mean, my goodness. Wow. Sui Davis of Kumoba just had a book out 2 years ago. Donald Epeki has, put together a collection, an anthology that was, I think it was also shortlisted for the BSFAs. So it's so cool that that we were able to do that. And yeah, like Minsu was saying, I mean, we got to make hay whilst white people remember that we're here before they forget and move on to other things. I do think though that because there is a growing diffusion of tastemakers and change makers in the world. So the people to please aren't necessarily still the big men of Hollywood or the big men of the big publishing centers, and maybe that will be a more permanent thing, because as we are in a computer age that has never been before, and I don't know. I mean, all it will take is one EMP and shorting us all out worldwide. But that's that's a science speculative fiction scenario. But but I do think that that it will change the landscape, especially if it continues to grow and continues to become more accessible to people, all over the world. Nigeria is a great example of where we sort of skipped. People were expecting us to kind of go through this industrial revolution so that we could get to a particular place, but instead we skipped all that and went right into the information revolution. And so you had you go to Nigeria and you'll see like market women with cell phones. We moved very quickly from a national phone grid, which collapsed overnight, and now we have like a proliferation of cell phones. So we don't even have a landline, like a nationally held landline grid anymore, and that's just because the technology allowed us to do that. What I think is interesting is that we are poised globally at a point where we can choose whether we continue as a species or not. I think climate change is going to be the thing maybe to look out for much more than any other type of technological or sociological revolution. The way we choose to deal with both climate change and the growing rise of authoritarianism around the world, I think is what's going to really define our future. And I think that it's great that we are starting to see how things can be different and how a diversity of voices can really help move things forward. But we're not out of the woods yet. We're just starting. We're just starting that journey. And some days I'm really, really hopeful, that we're going to take the right path and make the right decisions and head things off at the pass. And some days I'm like, maybe the dystopians have it. I don't know.
Nah, they're wrong. They're wrong. We're gonna make it.
Depends on whether I make it out into out of my PJs on a daily basis or not. That all depends on, it goes from day to day.
Yeah, no, hang out with me and you'll believe it. So I want to now move to another question, but it's sort of related. And so I was trying to think of sort of the institutions that do support the presence of people of color in this sort of storytelling realm that is so important. It's we have to envision this new world and make it happen. So who are the institutions that you see trying to take advantage, as you say, Minsu, of this moment of sunlight and grow from there? I have 3 names that I've come up with, but if you would care to comment on those 3, or if you have other suggestions, please chime in. The 3 that I came up with were Clarion West, which again, that's where Chanello and I met. And it's also, I looked through the table of contents for New Sons. Half of the people attended Clarion West, half of them. which one reviewer really did not like, by the way. They dinged me for it. Another one is ICFA, which is an acronym that stands for International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts, which was where I learned about your work, Minsu. And then the third one that I had listed was the Carl Brandon Society, which is the organization whose mission actually is to increase the support for people of color's representation in the fantastic genres for as content, as creators, as people putting it together, all of this. So those were my three picks: Clarion West, ICFA, and Carl Brandon Society. Minsu, can you comment on any of these or come up with another one?
Yeah, I'm afraid I think we should move on to Chanello, because I have not been very much involved in those organizations. I just came in. Into speculative writing organizations. So so I just sort of had to go into obliquely on my own. So I'm not qualified at all. So Chanello.
And you don't have any alternative suggestions, institutions that have helped you? Okay.
No.
Janella?
I think that Clarion West is huge, right? I completely agree with you. I was inspired to apply to Clarion West because Nnedi Okorafor, who was the first African woman that I saw writing speculative fiction, had gone to Clarion. The Clarion workshop in I think San Diego, and so when I felt that my work was sort of ready, or at least at a quality that I felt would get me in, I applied. I think another the Carl Brandon Society gave me the Octavia Butler scholarship that allowed me to attend. Because otherwise I wouldn't have afforded it. So yeah, I agree with you completely. I've never been to ICFA, even though I've been invited a couple of times. I've tried to make it out there. Donald Trump really messed with my, travel and visa plans, but that's a whole other story. I think one more that I would throw in is WisCon, which I also went to. It's the Wisconsin Convention of Science Fiction and Fantasy. It takes place. Oh gosh, what city does it take place? It's wonderful because it's got a low fee, a low signing fee. I think it was $50, which is comparatively low by convention standards. The city it takes place in is fairly cheap, so if you can make it there, finding a place to stay is not going to set you back too far. And it was where I met so many speculative writers and editors of color who I think if I hadn't, gone there that one time and made it out there and met so many people, it really helped my career, at least for me personally. And so I would recommend it highly to anyone who can make it. I think that in terms of institutions that are helping get people through the door, another interesting one I would say is that it's this thing on Twitter where people can write. I think it's called DV pitch. I think it's what it's called. So people can write in their pitches for their projects, and all these editors, agents can look at them and choose which projects to go with. And it's it's DV pitch, and it's amazing because it's only for people of color, and it's only for people who have not been previously published. So it's so cool to go through it when it goes. I think it's like a 3-day thing that happens, and see all these really cool ideas and hope that somebody somewhere is paying attention. I know that a good crop of people who are being published this year had their DV pitches out 2 years ago, and so
Could you say that again or spell it? Because I'm not quite catching.
It's actually a hashtag. It's hashtag DVPitch.
D as in dog, B as in boy.
D as in dog, V as in ventricle, pitch as in pitching a story or pitching a ball. And I don't know exactly when it happens, but it's usually this big internet thing. And it's organized by a small group of Black editors and agents. And they are looking specifically for stories by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they want you to pitch your ideas. Let them know what you're working on. Oh, it's also for queer people. It's also for queer people who are not people of color as well. And so many cool ideas come out of there. And it's just an interesting way for people who may not be able to get in the door in the regular way by, who they know or, being able to attend an MFA, for instance, which, is a big barrier for a lot of people. And is often the way that writers come up in the industry. It's a way for people who may not have that chance to get it. And it's really cool because it feels very grassroots. And I know that there have been people coming up from there. Another interesting space is Wattpad. You guys know do you know about that? It's it's Wattpad.
Oh, Wattpad, yes.
Yeah,
I just got word that Kathleen is able to join us now. So I can go ahead and introduce you, but my introduction will just be, it's Kathleen Alcala! Someone who again, we have a Clarion West connection, and you actually live on Bainbridge Island, right? In the Seattle area. Yeah. By the way, you're muted, Kathleen. And now you're gone. Well, that was exciting. I don't know if Kathleen will be able to come back. So we'll just continue finding out more about WhatsApp. Wattpad. Okay.
It's this sort of crowdfunded site where people can put out their fiction to their audience, and the audience actively gives them encouragement, tells them this is working, this isn't working, and stories that rack up the biggest audience, you produce your things in serialized format, and when you're done, if your story has resonated with the most people, you are able to get a book deal out of it. And a couple of books have come out last year that were Wattpad sourced, and it's just such a cool idea, there are all these little ways that people are using to bypass what we would consider mainstream publishing structures, and that's just really exciting.
Yeah, get past those gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. I know that there was at one point a speculative fiction publishing house that was all run by Black people, but they're no longer around. I have a middle grade novel coming out from Lee and Low, which is a minority-owned publisher, one of the few. And I also know that Aqueduct Press, though white-owned, has published, like about 30% of their novels and novellas are by people of color. So it wasn't deliberate, but then it wasn't keeping people out either. So one last question I think we have before we go to the audience. and this is something that people asked me, and I was unable to answer it. And maybe you will be the same. But did you, as you read New Suns, did you notice a common theme in the stories? Minsu?
Yeah. Resistance in many different ways. It's sometimes resistance comes afterwards, sometimes before a catastrophe, sometimes sometimes just presenting one's view itself, opening other people's eyes. And that was a theme that came up over and over and over again. I think my story was certainly about. It was certainly all about. What if you're working for tyrannical idiots, and and what can you do to prevent them from murdering people, right? And sometimes you have to get sneaky. And I was very moved by Chanello's story about this man who just could not give up the baby. I mean, it's like when in a culture where that just seemed to be when and when sort of people are doing it, I mean, they're giving away their with their children, especially the ones that they regard as sort of disposable children, all that. And also in Kathleen's story, you have a situation where there was a worldwide catastrophe, but now hope is not going to be in technology and in the old way of thinking. It's now going to be in the more traditional sort of method of true dreaming and so on, right? And I so even when a lot of the stories are not overtly about resistance, I saw that theme coming up over and over and over again, sometimes overtly and sometimes very subtly.
Thank you, because I could not come up with one. Chanello?
I'd say the same. I didn't see that theme, but now that you've mentioned it, Minsu, yeah, you're right. It's absolutely obvious. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that people of color, like you mentioned when you first started, we are all living one foot in one world and one foot in another. And so for us, it's easier in some ways to see the structures that hold everything up. And it's easier to see the flaws in those structures. I think if you want to ask, there's a saying, and I'm probably butchering it now, but there's a saying that if you want to ask how the earth is talk to the grass. So talk to the people at the bottom, and they'll tell you just where the system works and where the system doesn't. And so it tends to be people of color, people who are outside the power structures, who can most see the structures for what they are and how they work and don't work. And so, yeah, I think if you're going to put together a collection by people of color, that's what you'll get. You'll get people looking at things from a POV that is not often seen or is not often taken as seriously as it should be. And yeah, for me, I've stopped reading books by white men. I think there are an infinite variety of stories to be told, and in some ways, I often feel like I know what they're saying, I know where they're going, and at least for me, let me give other voices a little bit of a chance.
Okay, yeah. We're now at the point where we're starting to get questions from the audience, and we're going to give up on having Kathleen's face with us. If possible, I will try and read her things because she can still participate in our little private chat. But we'll start now with the first questions. Here's one from Beth May Fitzgerald. Do you think social media will help make the shift to inclusion permanent? We definitely didn't have that tool in the 90s and 70s. So will that be an aid to getting us to make this focus less trendy and more permanent?
Yeah, I agree with Chanello's point that she made earlier about how, yeah, maybe it is the internet and the digital culture that's gonna, I mean, maybe that's the sort of the new scientific revolution that's gonna make a permanent change, upon which we'll be able to ride it to make changes. So because I mean that it allows much more divergent voices to come in and take part in the conversation, but we still don't know what the. I mean, we're still faced with an awfully a lot of negative aspect of it. One of my professors that I had when I was in grad school, Professor Eugene Weber, who's legendary historian of France, he used to say that ideas are like the kitchen knife. I mean, you can use it to cut bread, or you can use it to murder your wife, because the thing in itself does not tell you what you're going to do with it, right? I mean, that is only a thing that cuts, right? And I feel the same way about the internet. I mean, used wisely, used for good, it can be such a wonderful tool for what we are doing, but also I can see the cyberbullying and the trolling and all of that just makes the situation much more dangerous. So yeah, sure. But I do think that there's a potential. It's definitely there.
And did you want to reiterate your point, Chanello, about that?
Well, I agree. I think that we're already seeing how, for instance, governments are using the internet, some as a tool of, oppression and hegemony to homogenize and control its population, and others as a tool of misinformation in which it, to gut democracies from the inside out. But at the same time, the internet has been this amazing tool of organization and protest and resistance. Yeah. I think that I can't say, because we are at a huge crossroads in the world right now, and we can go in any direction. We are poised to go full utopia or to go full dystopia. And honestly, I don't know which choice we're going to make. It would seem obvious that we could, pull ourselves back from the brink, but there are some very powerful interests that are really bent on drawing out every last bit of profit that they can in the now and damn the future, So we can only hope. Yeah.
I have a comment from Kathleen on the common theme question that I was asking. She says, I do see a common theme persisting in adversity. So that goes along with resistance, persistence. Yeah, going for it. I'm going to persist. I'm going to be all Pollyanna and believe in utopia and do my...
Just for the record, I believe in utopia too. I've put my money on that. I had a baby. I'm hoping that it's going to work out. So
here's a question from social media, no name attached. How do you all navigate tropes in your speculative fiction writing? Do you rely on them? Do you play with them? Do you try to avoid them? And then there's a sort of related question. Do you have any favorite tropes? So how do you use them? And do you have a favorite? And let's start with Chanello this time.
Oh, I love a good trope. I love when people are writing will set up a trope that I feel like I've seen before and then yank the rug right out from under me. I love that. I love seeing, the gangster that shows up and you're like, oh, he's going to beat some people. And then he turns out to be the sweetest guy. Or, yeah, I love a good trope. The thing is, there is nothing new under the sun, right? Anything that you think you've come up with, somebody else did it already. And what you have to do is take that trope and twist it and make it interesting again, and figure out what it is that you like about it, and then subverts expectations. I think what I find what turns me off the most, I think, in writing or in storytelling is when people set things up and then just do the expected thing. You know, they set up the bad guy, and he's just a bad guy who wants to do bad guy things. Or it sets up the hero, and he's a hero who does heroic things all the time. It's boring. So I say embrace tropes, but be always willing to play with them. Be always willing to deconstruct them, break them down, and remake them.
Do you have a favorite trope?
Oh yeah, I love a good bad guy that you didn't see coming. I love it when the expected villains and the expected heroes aren't exactly what you think. There's this sort of lazy thing I've seen where it's like, oh, let's deconstruct superheroes, and their superheroes are actually evil. But what about more complicated factors, like what does a superhero do when they become a parent, or when they have to navigate social situations where their powers just make no difference? What happens? A great example is WandaVision, where you have this incredibly powerful superhero who's grieving and doing the most unexpected things because she's dealing with this incredibly human emotion of grief. And to me, I think the best stories are the kind that take the things that we know and see. Oh, another trope I really love is the bad boy, but he's not bad. He's also good. We don't know. We're not sure. It's interesting. I love when people take stock characters and play with those stock expectations. I love that.
Yeah. Kathleen writes, subverting expectations is all the best. Surprise the reader. And she says, I am always looking for grace in an evil character. And she finishes, or actually began with, tropes. I try to bend them by applying my own cultural spin to them. Cultural spin to a trope. Minsu, do you have any?
Just to go off exactly what Chanello and Kathleen said, I think the first step is to get a particular trope and ask the question, is this a good trope? Is this a good trope in the sense that we can still squeeze some good use out of it, despite the fact that it's been around? Or is this a trope that needs to go, that has done nothing but evil, upon people's imagination? And if I could tell you a very brief personal story, so I started learning English when I was 11 years old, and the very first big book that I took on was Lord of the Rings. And when I began, I had to look up every other word. But by the time I got to Return of the King, I could get through it. And by the time I was done, I was like, yes, I can read English now. I have reading, capability of reading. So years and years, many decades pass, and the movie comes out, and I thought this was going to be just this amazing nostalgia trip for me. Because I haven't really looked at Tolkien since then, and I love the movie in the technical sense, but I was really appalled by this trope of entire species of beings being inherently evil.
Yeah.
That all you can do is just wipe them out, right? I mean, this sounded like a very typical Western imperial, justification for genocide. And also the way that so much of the characteristics is sort of race-based, and there's also lookism, certain beings being more beautiful and others, and so on, right? That's a trope that needs to go. I mean, that needs to be subversive and taken apart, and people need to be shamed for using that kind of trope, that an entire species of people just wrong and evil, and there's that you can't take, you can't do anything with. And speaking of that, the story that I'm working on right now for Nisi's new collection, it comes out of me teaching my students about the relatively new field of disability studies in the application of history, about looking at throughout history, which people were regarded as disabled and how they were treated and so on. Now, there was a time when disability, external abnormalities, was seen as an external manifestation of an inner wrongness,
Yes.
or manifestation and evil, and so on, right? Like in Richard III and so on. Now, I think all of us today would find that idea sick and disgusting, to look at a disabled person and imagine that that's an outward manifestation of an inner evil. But that's still around if you look at movies. I mean, just think about how many James Bond villains have a missing limb or disfigured face, or or artificial, prosthetic, and so on. And so it's still, and a lot of times when we see movies and TVs, we see villains with some kind of disability or stutter or some.
Yep.
We don't call people out on it, because they're still treating disability or any kind of abnormality as a sign of something abnormal going on inside, and that's a trope that must be combated. And just one more thing, that the recent sort of big thing that I'm just getting really annoyed with, and this is liable to piss off a lot of speculative people, but I am starting to really not like the chosen one trope.
Yes.
That's seriously
100%.
getting on my nerves.
100%.
Because I study revolutions, and relying on this one charismatic figure with virtual super strength, it's more damaging, because even if it's for a good cause, that's just one step away from fascism, right? But I think it's hard for people to actually, in a narrative, imagine a story in which it's not one individual, but lots of individuals doing their one individual part and coordinating and doing it together. And to me, at this point, the chosen one with the magical powers is it's lazy. It's just, it's ignorance about how changes in society occur. And by the way, I just, before I stop, I do want to recommend a Korean movie called 1987, When the Day Comes. And it's a fantastic movie about about how South Korea became a democratic country, about the revolution, democratic revolution in '87. It doesn't have one main character. It has a huge ensemble cast of people
Good.
from all walks of life doing their individual part to make this thing happen.
Good. We have a comment from Becky Smith, I think, that is in response to what you were just saying. Please write an orc hero reimagining of Lord of the Rings. And Kathleen agrees, definitely needs to go. Good equals beautiful, bad equals ugly, and also get rid of that chosen one thing. Yeah. Back to Becky Smith, the next question that I have. This is long. I hope I do it justice in reading it. This is Becky Smith's question. I feel like a lot of the speculative fiction I've been reading lately, especially Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction, is writing about the post-apocalyptic utopias, post-colonization, post-colonizers that rise up. Is this a movement you are seeing in the genre? A movement, I'm going to go back to a movement of post-apocalyptic utopias. Are you experimenting with that sort of thing yourself? Do you see it as a movement in the genre, or do you just have thoughts or comments about this? Yes, Chanello.
I'm actually experimenting with that stuff myself. I wrote a couple of really short stories. Both set in a post-apocalypse, where the challenge with me was creating a society without hierarchy, and this was incredibly difficult because the idea of hierarchy is so ingrained in the way we think about society, especially when you're coming out of Western ideas. But hierarchy isn't inevitable. Creating societies where everyone is regarded on the same footing, regardless of age or ability or appearance or anything like that, that was a real challenge. And it got me really excited because I wanted to do it again. And so this is something that I have been thinking about in terms of what happens and what comes when capitalism collapses. It's not an if, it's a when. Because what we are living, the time and space that we're living in is completely unsustainable. And so if we as a species want to move forward, capitalism is going to have to go, or it's going to take us down with it. And so when that happens, the traditional idea is that if capitalism goes, then what we'll have is like chaos in the streets. We'll have the Walking Dead style, people shooting each other in the face for a can of beans. But I contend, and I think there's a movement out there that suggests that that's not actually how human beings behave in the face of crisis. And there's been more and more research, sociological and psychological research that shows that that's just not what people do. It's a fantasy perpetrated by a very certain group of people for whom the system works. And, in some ways, for them, the collapse of the system would mean chaos. But that's not necessarily what's going to happen, right?
I'll just slide in here and say that one of my favorite books on this topic, nonfiction, is Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell.
Yep, that's the one. Yep.
Yeah, and that has been helpful to me as well in writing. I'm going to read Kathleen's comments and then turn it over to you, Minsu. Kathleen says, it takes many to have a successful revolution. Going back to our point about get rid of that chosen one theory. And Kathleen also says, for every advance, there will be setbacks. We have had, 75 years of technological advance? We're due for a big fall that probably just started with my computer refusing to connect with you. Minsu, have you seen a movement of post-apocalyptic utopias?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to Chanello's writings because I love the story so much. What she's gonna do with that genre, but I feel that genre is sort of running its course as well because there's just been so many, I mean the whole post-apocalypse thing. But I agree with Chanello about like people. They mistake their lack of imagination for what is possible and not impossible, right? In the same way that I think for people who are not imaginative, they really can't understand how imaginative people come out with stories. So they ask stupid questions like, have you done a lot of drugs and stuff like that? It's just like, it's like no, you just because you're not capable of coming out with the stories. But I was asked once about utopias and dystopias, and I was sort of going on a rant about dystopias, including post-apocalyptic ones, and so the questioner was asking me about, well, are you saying that we should write utopias instead? I was like, no, utopias, a lot of them, utopian thinking is what ends up creating dystopias a lot of times, right? So
I need a bumper sticker that says that.
Yeah, exactly, right? And the horrors of Stalinist Russia, they came out of utopian thinking and so on. So So the question is, so you're saying that we shouldn't write utopias or dystopias? And I think, well, I think there's been enough dystopias. I think there's been a whole variety of them. But I think what the world needs more, like way more than utopias and dystopias at this point, because dystopias can turn into oppression porn. People just sort of, I think a lot of people watch shows like The Walking Dead, and what they get out of it is that they have sort of this self-image of what a badass they would be in a situation like that. Whereas all kinds of people say, "Oh yeah, I would kick ass if I was in that kind of environment," right? All kinds of people that you see, and you just see that they'll be the first ones to go, right? But I said, so what we need in the age that we live in is not so much utopias and dystopias, but we need narratives of resistance. I mean, real resistance. I mean, real, and you know, not just based on good ideas, but real understanding of how actual changes occur and so on. You know, I loved watching the recent cable show about John Brown, Little Old Bird. Except that what struck me was that, yes, John Brown, I mean, the cause that you're working for, abolishment of slavery, is great, but your plan is stupid. That raid on Harper's Ferry. It's like there's a reason why amateurs shouldn't organize a military operation like that, right? And I mean, he comes out with this dumbass plan, and then when, especially the runaway slaves who had a lot more to lose, they point out flaws in his plan. His answer is, well, our cause is so righteous that God will step in if something goes wrong. That's not military strategy.
Yeah.
That's a morale booster. You can't use God's going to step in as part of your plan, right? So there's a great example of a great idealist working for the right cause, dumbass plan. So I would like to see more plans about more stories about good plans that actually pull off resistance and pull off revolutions and make the world a better place.
Quick question. What would you recommend people read that have good plans? Like, what kinds of, like, if you were doing that research, what are some good resources for good plans that actually pulled off positive revolutions?
Oh, yeah. You put me on a spot. I'm sure there's lots that, if I think about it, right? But you know what? I would say let's start with that movie, a Korean movie, 1987, about how the Korean people pulled off an absolutely successful democratic revolution, and you'll see step by step, you know, the way they go through it. You know, another movie some of my students enjoyed was this movie called Amazing Grace, about William Wilberforce, who managed to end the slave trade in the British Empire. And the way he also brought a whole bunch of people together across Britain to make the case of why Britain should no longer be in the slave trading business. And you know, and it was, again, it wasn't all him. You know, there's lots of people who are involved in the abolitionist movement in Britain. You know, at the time, and there's a successful way they did it.
So we are just about out of time. We've got to shut it down, folks. There's a couple of more comments in here. A question from Frankie Hawkins: can we purchase and read your hierarchical less story, Chanello?
Yeah, it's on slatemagazine.com, and it's part of a project called Future. I think it's Future Tense. I can put the link for you guys in the notes for the future. So yeah, it's called When We Call a Place Called Home.
And there's I guess we just don't have time for the questions. Comment from Dean and Sandy Smith. There's a hint of hope near the end of The Two Towers, where two orcs, Gorbag and Shagrat, are chatting on their way back to the tower. Gorbag brings up the idea of the two of them slipping off and setting up somewhere on their own with no big bosses. I have always hoped they made it. I hope so too. Yeah. I think that's it for us for now, though. And yes, as we've mentioned, there will be a new Sons 2, so stay tuned.
Excellent. Nisi, Chanello, Minsu, Kathleen, thank you all for this. It's been wonderful. And I want to especially thank our tech crew, Lauren and Laura on the back end. Great work. We appreciate you. We have a book giveaway. We've randomly selected a winner from those who asked questions in the comments. Congratulations, Beth May Fitzgerald. You'll receive a copy of the New Sons anthology. All you have to do is reach out to mail@unboundbookfestival.com. That's mail@unboundbookfestival.com, and we'll be sure to get the book to you. Again, our thanks to this evening's sponsors, Friends of the MU Libraries. on Tuesday, March 2nd at 7 p.m. Central Time. Unbound will continue with the panel Representation in Publishing, featuring Stephanie Williams, Parnisa Jones, Beth De Guzman. And I hope you'll join us and you'll continue coming and enjoying these wonderful panels. All right. So be it, see to it, lead on with light.
I know that quote.
I knew what.